Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Ed Pritchard and I work for Miami-Dade County Parks, Miami Eco Adventures. This webinar series is a joint effort between UF-IFAS Extension, Florida Sea Grant, Miami-Dade County Parks, and Miami Eco Adventures. We really appreciate you coming out tonight for our August conservation conversation. Just a few housekeeping items before we go ahead and get started. Everyone in the webinar is currently muted and your videos are off. We please ask that you remain that way. And if you do have any questions for our presenter, you can go ahead and type those in the chat box that you can find at the bottom. Those questions will be moderated and we will answer those at the end of the session. Also, our webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out a link to this recording within the next week. So you can share this with anyone else interested. You can also follow us on social media at Miami-Dade Sea Grant and at Miami Eco Adventures, where we will advertise these webinars and we also showcase related content. And if you want to receive an email reminder about when these quarterly conservation conversations take place and the registration links for those, you can email Anna. She'll put her email in the chat and you can reach out and get that information. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to tonight's presenter, Anna, who will be talking about invasive pulse corals.
All right, thanks, Ed. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new names enter our webinar series. So before we get into things, I would just like to introduce myself. My name is Anna Zangroniz. I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent for Miami-Dade County. And this is a branch of the University of Florida known as the UF-IFAS Extension Service, which is a state-county partnership between the University of Florida and Miami-Dade County Parks and Rec. And my job is to deliver or extend marine science information to marine and coastal community members. And those are largely individuals who either work or rely upon the water for their fun or their livelihood, or both. Now, what we're going to be going into tonight, we're first going to begin with a little bit of a vocabulary lesson. I like to do that because there's a lot of terminology around invasive species, so I like to make sure that we're all on the same page. Then we'll talk more specifically about the pulse corals themselves. I'll go over a short timeline of the invasion that is currently happening. I'll talk about the ecological effects or the environmental effects of these species, what that could mean for South Florida, as I want to emphasize, this is not something that is in Florida yet, but it could have consequences for us. And then things that can be done for people to help. Just going to ask whoever is not muted to mute your microphones, please. Thank you. So to begin, I want to go over our terminology. And first, we will start with native species. And these are species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. And the key word in that sentence is geographic. So it's related to a specific area of the world. Non-native or exotic, those are species that do not occur naturally in a specific geographic area. An introduced species is a species that is brought to a new area either by accident or on purpose by humans. So if we had to highlight a word there in that sentence, it would be the word humans. An established species is one that has a self-sustaining and reproducing population with no need for human intervention. So these can be native or non-native species. And lastly, invasive species are those that are non-native, introduced by humans, and either does or can cause environmental, economic, or human harm, or a combination of the three. And that takes us to pulse corals. And we get this common name of pulse corals because it captures several different species. And pulse corals, some people geek out on the taxonomic classification here. I'm going to simplify it a little bit. Pulse corals are soft corals. They are different than the reef-building stony corals that make up the backbone of our coral reefs here. And the common name of soft corals is given because they do not have that calcium carbonate or hard skeleton, and therefore will move back and forth in the water as the water moves. So these are similar to other animals, other invertebrates, because they have tentacles. So they are related to jellyfish and anemones. And so for our purposes, we're focusing on two species specifically. And I personally like the way they sound, but it can get a little overwhelming sometimes. But I love the scientific names, Eunomia stolonifera and Xenia umbellata. And the things that I want to highlight about these pulse corals, these are two different species, but they share the same characteristics. And so you'll notice here is that these pulse corals that will grow vertically, but they are all connected by this horizontal base called stolons. And so those network of stolons, you can think of them if you've ever seen a strawberry patch, like strawberry runners that connect the strawberry patch, they will attach to a hard surface and then grow vertically with those upright stalks. And the thing that's really important here about those stolon is that this gives these animals a great deal of diversity in terms of habitat that they can live in, because they can attach very successfully to soft habitats in addition to hard ones like coral reefs. Now the photos that you're seeing on your screen, the two here on the left, that is one species particularly, these are the Eunomia, and on the right we have the Xenias. And so they are very, very similar. They have these long elongated stalks with groups of 8 tentacles. And so if you're a little bit more familiar with some of the biology of corals, soft corals are also referred to as octocorals, octo meaning 8. So at the end of each one of these stalks, there are 8 tentacles. And so the thing here, the main characteristic, they can present in a wide variety of color variations. So that can also look different to the naked eye, depending on the light availability, the depth that you are. But if you direct your attention to the photograph on the right, all of these that I'm tracing here with my mouse, this is all Xenia. It's all the same species, but we've got colomorphs. So we've got this more bluish gray variation in addition to this more common brownish gold variation. So we've got these long polyps. They form what look to be a very mesmerizing shag carpet. And if you look here at these tentacles on the polyp, they are able to retract or close up a little bit, but they don't close all the way. And so to give you a better idea of what I mean by this, if you imagine holding your hand out in front of you and waving your fingers, all right, your fingers are the tentacles. And our native soft corals or octocorals can retract those tentacles all the way. So imagine closing your hand and making a tight fist. So that's what our native ones can do. However, these invasive species, they cannot close those tentacles all the way. So therefore, they are always moving, and it produces this very obvious, consistent pulsing behavior. It's very visual, it's very pronounced. And in this, I just wanted to embed this video. This is a video from Venezuela, just to give you a visual of what one of these species looks like, because this is where it has been in its invaded range for the longest amount of time. So they've been studying it for quite a while. And unfortunately, there is a pretty substantial amount of cover of this species in Venezuela. And so you can see it really well here, how it's moving, that while the stalks are moving with the water, those tentacles are constantly moving, even if the water is not. So this is available on YouTube, and I'm happy to include it when I send the follow-up email. One thing I want to note about this is that the pulse corals are very highly sought after in the aquarium trade. And that's because they're gorgeous. They produce this mesmerizing effect. They're also effective at removing certain nutrients and particulates from the tanks. And you can buy them in aquarium stores or on the internet for anywhere from $20 to $200, depending on their size and depending on their color. It's a very popular aquarium organism. So that leads us to ask the question, where do these come from? And so we're highlighting again these two specific species, and you'll see the red stars are zinnias, and they are found usually in the Red Sea and near Israel, Madagascar, and South Africa, where Eunomia tends to come from a little bit further east in the Indo-Pacific region, here close to Indonesia, but has also been documented in Japan and Taiwan. And regardless of whatever species we're talking about, you can see that it's a very clear distinction geographically from where we are over here on the west. And so we have 4 distinct sites of where these species have been found in our side of the world. So Eunomia has been found in Venezuela, as I mentioned, as well as Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Zinnia has been found in Puerto Rico and Cuba. So long way from home. Now, if we look, how did we get here? How did this start? Well, it all started in Venezuela on the northern coast of South America. And so ground zero, if you will, was this area called Playa Valle Seco. And it was thought that Eunomia was intentionally introduced for aquarium purposes in the very early 2000s. So people thought, hey, this is a good idea. We'll put this in the water, we'll grow it, and then be able to trade it or sell it and furnish aquarium tanks. And unfortunately, that didn't really go the way they thought, because by 2013, they had found Eunomia in additional sites closer to the east. And by 2022, they had found that it had spread over to the west also. So a pretty substantial area that has now been colonized by this invasive species. In Hawaii, Eunomia was discovered in 2020. So of course, you may remember 2020 was a challenging year for many reasons. And one of those, aside from the pandemic, was that this was a very isolated area on a military base. So that really limited the access of the personnel who could go there to survey, to determine and identify and remove. So when it was thought that this was likely the result of someone having dumped their aquarium in that particular area. And unfortunately, it was a really small area that has now spread to about 80 acres. And more recently, in February of 2022, there were sites on the northern coast of Cuba. At first, it was a very small site, less than 1 meter squared, and it was removed. It was successfully removed, and it seemed that there was no regrowth, at least initially. However, the reports have confirmed that in other areas, there are small patches still being found. And initially, it was thought that what was found was Eunomia, but later genetic analysis proved that it was, in fact, Zinnia. And last fall, in October, Zinnia, or they thought initially Eunomia, but later proved through genetic analysis, determined that there was Zinnia on the waters off of La Parguera, Puerto Rico, which is off the southwest coast. So more on this a little bit later. How do we end up with invasive species? There are a few different mechanisms in which they are introduced to this invaded range. And in the case of the pulse corals, as I mentioned, they are often propagated or grown intentionally as a very high value aquarium organism. And so this is what is thought that this was likely how it started in Venezuela. And as I mentioned just a couple of slides ago, in Hawaii, it's suspected that the organism ended up in the water because someone decided to dump their aquarium. And as you may have observed from that video I showed a few moments ago, this is a really prolific growing species. And so while it's beautiful and it's mesmerizing, unfortunately, it can also then overgrow and outcompete other organisms in that aquarium, which is why some people may not want it any longer. But it's extraordinarily difficult to remove successfully. And lastly, an unintentional vector, if you will, of ballast water. Ballast is a mechanism in which large commercial vessels, they suck in a bunch of water to help stabilize their vessel when it's underway, when it makes a trip. And then when it lands in its port, it releases that water. So an organism that entered the ship at point A could then end up being accidentally released at point B. So this is thought that this was the thought that of how this ended up in northern Cuba. But it's also something that's quite challenging to confirm. So why is this a bad thing? I had someone ask me, well, it looks so pretty. What's the problem? Well, the problem is its ability to grow. It grows very fast, it grows very thick, and it can grow on any type of habitat. So these are some photos from Venezuela. This photo on the left shows Eunomia completely surrounding a brain coral. And here in the photograph on the right, these are tufts. This is essentially those lovely shag carpets that maybe some of your family members had during the 1970s, and it is colonizing any available surface. And so if you remember that stolen system, it really gives these organisms a great opportunity to grow on whatever it wants. It doesn't require a hard surface the way that stony corals do. And unfortunately, in Venezuela, as has been documented with studies over the course of almost 20 years now, they're experiencing as little as 30% cover to almost 100% cover of the Eunomia pulse coral specifically. And so not only does that increase the ability of these native corals and other organisms to survive, it also then takes up space. How do corals reproduce? Well, they can reproduce, some of them by fragmenting, but they also can reproduce by sexual reproduction, in which the egg bundles and the sperm meet and create these little babies. And those little babies need to find a clean, suitably hard surface to settle on and grow. And they can't do that if that available space is taken up. Something else that is now being studied in Venezuela is to see, what does this mean for fish? Because yes, fish can move, so they're not necessarily going to be smothered in quite the same way that other benthic, sessile, or stationary organisms are. But in this photo, these yellow circles are circling fish in what was once a reef area. So the Venezuelan scientists are looking to see how this invasion is affecting local fish populations. And additionally, because these species can grow on soft habitats, they also have the ability to smother out seagrass. So it's not just limited to coral reefs that are a little bit further away from shore. So since these are corals, they get their nutritional values from two different sources. The first is through that symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae, same as stony corals, in which they are able to convert energy from sunlight into their nutrition source. They are also able to feed through suspension feeding using those tentacles to capture zooplankton and phytoplankton. These species do grow quite rapidly, and they can overtake other corals. They are also able to reproduce both ways that most stony corals can. And the asexual reproduction, or more simply put, fragmenting, this is a particular concern because even if a removal is attempted and that's not done properly, any piece that is left behind or a piece that breaks off and floats away can continue to grow. So it's pretty scary when you consider it because it's beyond anything of what our native species can do. So there has been quite a bit of study dedicated to understanding what impacts invasive species have on communities. And I really like this graphic. This was put together by Dr. Shirley Baker from the University of Florida. And there's already evidence, at least in Venezuela, that fishing catches are down. They are lower in areas that have been invaded by Eunomia. So not only is there that ecological impact of biodiversity loss and loss of habitat, it's also having an economic and social impact, which is really important, particularly for areas that rely upon either artisanal or subsistence fisheries. And then, of course, there are consequences when you consider what that means from an economic perspective in areas that rely upon a healthy coral reef system for tourism purposes. I mean, this is a pretty simplified graph. I think it could have even more branches and arrows, but especially when you consider the cost associated with trying to remove and manage for this, you have to consider not just personnel, but tools and boats and fuel and weather. It's just a lot of moving parts that are, I think, just unbelievably more challenging than any sort of land-based invasive species. So for the next few moments, I'm going to touch upon some of the techniques that have been tried in different areas for removal. And I want to make sure that I give the disclaimer that don't try this at home. In some of these areas, these are countries outside of the United States, so therefore their regulatory requirements are different, but they are all working in compliance with their local agencies. But again, please don't try this at home because there are risks associated with it, especially from a regulatory perspective. So the first is physical removal. And this is a technique in which scuba divers are using knives as well as hammers and chisels to remove the entire colony from the bottom. In areas where you might have these growing on seagrasses, that's pretty easy. But in areas where you have these growing on hard substrate, that becomes definitely more difficult to make sure that you're getting the entire colony and also trying to minimize damage to the resource. And more difficulties associated with this, it's labor intensive. I don't know if anyone has ever done work around the house with a mallet or a hammer, like removing baseboards or installing baseboards. It takes a lot of time. It requires a lot of precision. In this case, this also requires the conditions outside to be right. It's one of those, it can't be too rough. It can't be too windy. There needs to be good visibility. There can't be surge because there are a lot of activities happening at once while this removal technique is happening. So, and this can only happen in areas with really small amounts. This would not probably be very appropriate for a large field of it, as you saw in some of the photographs earlier. And this does require working in teams because while one individual is working, the other individual is making sure that they've collected all of the pieces, that they're going into a plastic trash bag underwater that is then placed into a lobster bag to make sure that none of the pieces escape. And again, making sure that you've gotten the entire attachment point, that you're not leaving anything behind. Another approach that has been going on in Venezuela and Hawaii to treat these larger areas is to essentially smother the pulse corals by starving them of sunlight. If you remember, they do have this symbiotic relationship that requires photosynthesis. So by placing these black plastic coverings or tarps, this is pretty effective in killing the colonies in a relatively small time period. However, this is still labor intensive, and there is that regulatory question of, well, if you're covering one thing, what else are you covering under there that may also be dependent upon photosynthesis? So those things have to be evaluated and considered when proposing this type of removal. And another thing is if there's any sort of breach of the attachment points, whether from storm or major wind, this whole thing can come off and then become trash. A floating trash bag with potential little babies hanging on to it, because that was found in some of these studies, was that they found new recruits, little sexual recruits of these species that were hanging out, having attached themselves to the tarps. Fortunately, being in the 21st century, other approaches are also being considered. And a researcher in Venezuela is looking at the potential for a biopesticide derived from chemical defenses of sea hares or aplasia. So this is one thing that is being experimented with at this point. And an entrepreneur has started a company called Unomia Solutions, who has developed this ultrasound gun that pulverizes the pulse corals and then sucks them up with a suction pump to collect all of any potential floating fragments. So that's particularly interesting to me. I'm not sure if that would even be permissible here in the US, but I'm eager to see what the results of these experiments are. Some of you may be familiar with this graphic. There are different versions of this graphic over time. This is what's known as the invasion curve. And the invasion curve is broken into 4 periods, if you will. And the first is prevention, and that's where we are here in Florida. Again, this species, neither of these species have been found here yet. So this is the most cost-effective and effective in general, and that's to stop the problem before it starts. The next phase is eradication, where maybe there are a few localized populations and it may be possible to remove them entirely, but that requires very intense coordination and rapid response. So it's effective, but does cost more than prevention. This third phase here is the containment phase, and that's usually where that complete eradication is unlikely, and this is usually when the public starts to learn of things like this. And finally, when we get into this 4th phase, this resource management phase, it's really just a matter of trying to keep the populations at the lowest feasible levels and protect natural resources, protect the most valuable natural resources. And so, as I said, Florida, it's not here yet. We're really working hard because, as a colleague I just saw yesterday said, we can't have lionfish happen again. So we're really working hard to up the level of awareness and education that is available. And with that said, we've already, at least within UF-IFAS and Florida Sea Grant, we've already been in conversations about this particular topic for almost a year, because we know that the best way to prevent is through awareness and education. And so last year we had a meeting with some of the Venezuelan scientists and Cuban scientists to learn about the issue, and they shared what they've been doing in terms of best practices for study and management and removal. Just last week, I was in Puerto Rico for a workshop. It was targeted towards Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, but Florida was invited to participate as well, because obviously this is very relevant and possible given the proximity of the presence of these in northern Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from our coral reef. Some of us at Florida Sea Grant also helped develop a professional, or I shouldn't say professional, but an official congressional 2-pager, which was presented to Congress at the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force this past spring. I do want to give the disclaimer that this is the draft version that hasn't been fully approved by NOAA yet, but this is what it's going to look like. UF-IFAS put out a press release on July 1st, and that was picked up by at least a half a dozen different media outlets around the state. We've also produced fact sheets and flyers, some of which have already been distributed to different dive shops in the Florida Keys. And Dr. Shirley Baker held an in-service training for UF-IFAS faculty, and we also have other resources that are available that we can make useful to you. And myself and other colleagues, both within University of Florida IFAS and outside of that, we are also part of the larger aquatic invasive species task force that is overseen by NOAA. So this is something that is being taken very seriously, and we're really working hard to try and stay in front of it. Here in the US, there are some programs that already exist that we're really trying to push a little bit more broadly. The Don't Let It Loose program that educates aquarists on the practices, or don't dump, so not releasing their aquarium species. And FWC also offers resources on what they can do with unwanted pets. Here on the right is one of the examples of one of the most recent flyers that we have created. And at least within UF-IFAS and Florida Sea Grant, we are looking at a two-pronged approach for communication. And the first is to really work heavily with scuba divers and snorkelers. So we're really trying to get people up to date, understanding, knowing what to look for, and being able to identify, to try and have eyes on the water. So if this is spotted, that it can be responded to in a very timely fashion. And in fact, that's how it was discovered in Puerto Rico. Was a dive operator saw this and they said, that looks strange, and called the local resource management agency. So thankfully that happened, and at least they were able to respond immediately. And then the other pronged approach, which we're still in discussion about, is to really try to figure out a great and appropriate and effective campaign for the aquarists and the aquarium industry. Because they're the aquarium providers, and then there are the hobbyists, which are people like you and me who may have a home aquarium and may want to house one of these species. So that is still in discussion. We're still trying to figure out the best and most effective approach. If you are on the water or in the water, we're really asking everybody to keep their eyes open. And I said it, I'll say it now, and I'll emphasize it again later, is that if you do see something, please don't try to remove it. Number one, because it might not be one of these pulse corals, but more importantly, if you try to remove it, or I should say, number one, it might not be a pulse coral. Number two, you can't just take things out of the ocean without permission. And number three, if it is a pulse coral and you do it and it's not done properly, whatever's left behind or whatever floats away we still have a problem. So that I just really want to make sure that that point is driven home. Instead, we're asking for photographs. Photographs are fantastic. If you're able to provide GPS coordinates, that's great as well. If not, a general location, say, for example, Lauderdale by the Sea, straight off of the Datura portal, get us in the neighborhood. And additionally, there is an online portal that is hosted by the Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment called the Zenith Soft Coral Learning Exchange. And on that page, there's a bunch of linked resources. There's also a map where sightings have been reported, as well as links to papers that you can read if you really want to get into the big science of this. We're trying to funnel any reporting to the U.S. Geological Survey's non-Indigenous aquatic species website. There are a lot of different reporting mechanisms out there, so we're trying to focus this as much as possible, at least within Florida. So this is the website that we are asking people to report to. If worse comes to worse, you think you see something, and you're not sure, you don't remember the website, you can always email me and I'll help get you there. So with that, I want to recognize all the incredible work that has been done by the scientists in other countries who are really actively working on this, and especially in Puerto Rico. And I'm giving them a big sending positive thoughts because they're getting pretty wet right now with the tropical storm passing by. But they have really made huge strides in the last 6 months in their genetic analysis of this, as well as their response. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for your time and open it up to any questions you may have.